Ladies and gentlemen, imagine walking through the glittering streets of New York City in the late 19th century, a time known as the Gilded Age. The skyline is rising with new wealth. Carriages roll past Broadway's shining lights, and fortunes are being made overnight. But just a few blocks away from this splendor, beyond the reach of chandeliers and silk gowns, lies a very different New York, one hidden in shadows and stench. This is the world of the tenements, overcrowded, disease-ridden buildings where thousands of families lived stacked on top of one another like forgotten cargo. For every mansion built uptown, there was a crumbling brick block downtown, bursting with the laborers, immigrants, and children who made the city's prosperity possible. When the great wave of immigration swept through Ellis Island, millions came chasing the American dream. But for many, that dream ended in a single, suffocating room. A tenement might house 10 or 12 people in one space no larger than a modern kitchen. There was no running water, no sunlight, and no sanitation. The air was thick with coal smoke and sewage. In the summer, the rooms were ovens. In the winter, they were tombs. Disease found its perfect home here. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid fever, and smallpox spread like wildfire through the narrow hallways. Children coughed themselves to death as rats scurried across their beds. In some neighborhoods, the death rate was higher than that of war-torn Europe. Medical reports of the time called these tenements breeding grounds of pestilence, and they were right. The rich, living just miles away, barely noticed. They called it progress. They marveled at the city's growing skyline, while ignoring the corpses being carried out of the slums each morning. Newspapers would sometimes describe the tenement districts as plague zones, yet little was done. The landlords kept collecting rent. The politicians looked the other way. Journalists like Jacob Riis changed that. With his camera and his book, How the Other Half Lives, he dragged America's conscience into those dark rooms. His photographs revealed the hollow faces of starving children, the mothers nursing infants beside open drains, the men collapsed from exhaustion on bare floors. He showed the glittering Gilded Age for what it really was, a golden mask covering a diseased face. Beneath the promises of opportunity and progress was a city rotting from within. The diseases of the tenement were not just biological, they were moral. Poverty itself had become contagious, spreading through neglect and greed. And yet, out of that misery, something began to stir. Reformers, doctors, and social workers started to demand change. They fought for better housing laws, for clean water, for proper ventilation and sanitation. Slowly, the city began to awaken, but the lesson of those tenements remains with us. The Gilded Age may have passed, but inequality has not. The disease-filled rooms of the past echo in today's forgotten neighborhoods, where the poor still breathe the polluted air of neglect, while wealth towers above them in glass and steel. History teaches us that a city divided between glitter and grime cannot thrive. The tenements of New York's Gilded Age remind us that progress without compassion is just another form of decay. The Gilded Age of New York was a time of dazzling progress and dizzying inequality, a period in which the city's skyline began to scrape the heavens while its foundations rotted beneath the weight of neglect. To understand this era, one must first see the city as it truly was, divided not just by class but by entirely different worlds that existed within the same few square miles. On one side stood the palaces of Fifth Avenue, where gilded mansions gleamed under the glow of chandeliers, their marble halls echoing with laughter. Champagne glasses clinking in celebration of fortunes made in steel, oil, and railroads. On the other side, down the narrow streets of the Lower East Side, humanity was compressed into dark, airless tenements where whole families slept in shifts and disease whispered through the thin walls. This contrast was not accidental. It was the product of an economy designed to elevate a few and exploit the many, to glorify wealth while disguising poverty beneath a veneer of progress. New York in the late 19th century was the beating heart of American capitalism, a city swollen with ambition and greed. The upper classes spoke the language of opportunity and destiny, their lives chronicled in the society pages of newspapers that celebrated the rise of America's new aristocracy. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Morgans. They hosted grand balls where women wore diamonds the size of grapes, where a single evening's entertainment could cost more than an entire tenement building. The Gilded Age was named not for its purity but for its plating, a thin layer of gold that masked the base metal beneath. Beneath the glow of gas lamps and the elegance of horse-drawn carriages lay the other New York, where the poor trudged home from 12-hour shifts in sweatshops, their faces blackened by soot and their lungs filled with dust. The immigrant wave that fueled the city's expansion brought millions of souls seeking a better life. They came from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Germany, and beyond, each carrying dreams of opportunity. But the city that greeted them was merciless. Upon arrival, many found themselves trapped in slum housing so dense that sunlight could not reach the ground. The tenements were packed so tightly together that air barely moved, creating breeding grounds for sickness and despair. These were not homes. They were holding pens for human labor. The same industries that made the Gilded Age glitter relied on this invisible population of the desperate. For every opulent mansion, there were countless laborers who had built it. For every silk gown, there were factory girls stitching it by candlelight. The stark contrast between wealth and poverty was visible even in the geography of the city. Uptown, the avenues were broad and tree-lined, filled with fresh air and space. Downtown, the streets narrowed, clogged with horse-drawn carts, sewage, and the noise of endless labor. The rich lived high above the filth, both literally and metaphorically, while the poor were confined to the dark underbelly of the city. A person could walk from Fifth Avenue to the Bowery in less than an hour and travel centuries in conditions. The glittering shop windows of Broadway reflected only part of the story. Behind those reflections were sweatshops where men and women toiled for pennies. It was a time when the American dream was both born and betrayed. The industrial boom created unprecedented wealth, but it also demanded human sacrifice. Child labor filled the factories, and women worked until their hands bled, yet they could barely afford rent in the tenements. Meanwhile, the elite justified their comfort through the rhetoric of social Darwinism. The belief that their wealth was proof of superiority, that poverty was the natural order for the unfit. Newspapers glorified tycoons as captains of industry, while the people who actually built their empires were invisible, existing in the dim glow of gaslights and the stench of overcrowded rooms. In the glittering ballrooms of the Gilded Age, guests dined on oysters and champagne, while just blocks away families survived on bread crusts and weak soup. The disparity was so obscene that social reformers compared it to feudal Europe, where lords and peasants occupied entirely different realities. Yet the city's elite spoke of progress and philanthropy, establishing charities and foundations that eased their consciences without changing the system that made such inequality inevitable. They built libraries and museums that bore their names, monuments to their generosity, while those who cleaned their halls or stitched their garments remained nameless. The tenement districts became the physical embodiment of the city's moral contradictions. On the surface, New York was the world's great modern metropolis, a beacon of progress, innovation, and wealth. Beneath that surface, the tenements festered like open wounds. In the same city that boasted opera houses and electric lights, thousands of children died from diseases like tuberculosis and diphtheria. For every monument to progress, there was a graveyard of the forgotten. The disease-filled alleys and cramped stairways of the Lower East Side told a story that the rich preferred not to hear, one of suffering and survival in the shadows of luxury. The sharp contrast between the rich and poor also shaped the city's culture. While the upper class attended theatre and opera, the working class found solace in saloons and cheap amusements. Crime, alcoholism, and despair spread in neighborhoods where hope was scarce. Reformers and journalists described the tenements as human anthills, where people lived without privacy, dignity, or rest. Yet even in such misery, communities formed. Immigrants clung to their traditions, their languages, and their faiths. Within those dark rooms, they found ways to laugh, love, and endure. The contrast was not only economic but existential. The rich lived to enjoy, the poor lived to survive. The city's politicians, often backed by wealthy industrialists, made sure this system endured. Corruption was rampant, from Tammany Hall to the police force. Building codes were ignored, landlords profited from every inch of space, and inspectors were bribed to look away. The government existed not to protect the poor, but to maintain order, to keep the machinery of industry turning. The poor were seen as necessary fuel for the city's growth, expendable, replaceable, invisible. It was not just an economic divide, it was a moral one. The elite lived in a world of illusion, convinced that their luxury was a sign of progress, when in truth it was built on decay. The city's newspapers often depicted the wealthy as paragons of virtue, celebrating their banquets, their travels, their donations. But occasionally, glimpses of the other world broke through. Articles described families suffocating in rooms with no ventilation, children dying in tenement fires, and mothers forced to choose between food and rent. The contrast between the reporting of high society and the hidden reality of the slums created a growing sense of unease among those who dared to look closer. The illusion of the Gilded Age depended on ignorance, on the refusal to acknowledge the human cost of progress. Architecturally, the city mirrored this divide. The mansions of the rich rose with ornate facades, decorated with imported marble and ironwork, symbols of excess that seemed almost defiant. Meanwhile, the tenements were built quickly and cheaply, their walls cracking within years, their foundations sinking under the weight of their inhabitants. The very air seemed to separate the classes, the clean, perfumed breeze of Central Park versus the stifling heat of Mulberry Street. At night, one part of the city glittered under electric lights, while the other was shrouded in darkness, lit only by dim kerosene lamps. The moral blindness of the era was staggering. The wealthy saw their own success as proof of divine favor, while the suffering of the poor was seen as punishment or failure. Churches preached patience and obedience to the working class, while blessing the fortunes of the powerful. The divide was not only material, it was spiritual. In sermons and speeches, the language of charity replaced the language of justice. Rather than change the conditions that caused poverty, society sought to comfort the poor enough to keep them quiet. Yet despite the cruelty of this contrast, it also exposed the truth about industrial progress, that every golden age is built upon invisible labor. The wealth of the few was extracted from the sweat and sickness of the many. The tenements were not a side effect of progress, they were its foundation. Every glittering skyscraper, every factory, every mansion stood upon the bodies of those who could never afford to leave the slums. The disease-filled neighborhoods of New York were the hidden price of America's rise to power. Those who lived through it rarely had the chance to tell their stories. Their lives were measured not in achievements but in survival. The Gilded Age elite built legacies that would be remembered in history books, while the poor left only faint traces. Photographs, statistics, and the words of reformers who spoke in their name. But those traces reveal the true nature of the age. The contrast between wealth and poverty was not simply economic. It was an entire structure of existence that defined who mattered and who did not. In the glittering illusion of the Gilded Age, New York appeared as a city of opportunity. In truth, it was two cities occupying the same space, one built on marble, the other on dust. The distance between Fifth Avenue and the Lower East Side was not measured in miles but in humanity. It was a chasm filled with hunger, disease, and despair, crossed only by those brave enough to see both sides. The bright lights of one world cast long shadows over the other, and in those shadows millions struggled unseen. The Gilded Age sparkled, but beneath its surface it was deeply, irreparably divided. The tenement housing of New York's Gilded Age stood as both a physical structure and a social indictment, representing the hidden reality of urban life beneath the illusion of progress. These buildings, hastily constructed to contain the endless wave of immigrants and working poor, became breeding grounds for disease, misery, and hopelessness. Their brick walls enclosed a world of constant struggle, where human beings were reduced to mere survival. Each tenement was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, dim staircases, and suffocating rooms that held within them the true cost of the city's industrial expansion. The air was thick with the smell of refuse, rotting food, and unwashed bodies, a tangible reminder of how neglect and greed could transform a city into a living organism of decay. The tenement districts, places like the Lower East Side, 5 Points, and Hell's Kitchen, were among the most densely populated areas in the world during the late 19th century. Buildings meant to hold a few families now housed dozens, with entire floors divided into makeshift rooms, separated by thin boards or hanging cloth. There was rarely any plumbing. Most buildings had a single outhouse for dozens of residents, overflowing and flooding the air. Water had to be fetched from public pumps or wells, which were often contaminated with sewage. Garbage piled up in the streets because there was no organized system of waste collection. Flies, rats, and disease, carrying insects infested every corner. The population density in some of these districts reached over 1,000 people per acre. The city's poor lived packed tighter than cattle, their every breath shared with strangers and their every cough echoing through the walls. The diseases that flourished in these conditions were both inevitable and catastrophic. Tuberculosis, known as the White Plague, claimed more lives than any other illness in the tenement slums. It was the disease of poverty thriving in dark, damp, unventilated rooms where families slept side by side. Infants perished at alarming rates, their fragile lungs unable to withstand the foul air. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread through contaminated water supplies, and entire households could fall ill within days. Measles and smallpox swept through neighborhoods like wildfire. In one recorded epidemic, nearly 1 in 10 residents of certain tenement blocks succumbed to infectious disease. Doctors and reformers described these areas as factories of death, where the poor were born only to be consumed by the city itself. Despite the misery, the tenements continued to multiply. Landlords discovered that the poor offered the perfect business opportunity. They had nowhere else to go and would pay whatever was demanded for even the smallest space. A single tenement could yield enormous profits. With no regulation and little oversight, builders crammed as many people as possible into every square foot. A family of 6 or 8 might rent one small room, often sharing it with boarders to make ends meet. Beds were rented in shifts. A man working the night shift would sleep in a bed during the day while another worker used it at night. In many buildings, there was no direct sunlight. Windows opened only onto narrow air shafts, which quickly filled with garbage and sewage, turning them into vertical cesspools. The air inside was heavy and still, and in the summer heat, it became nearly unbearable. Children grew up in these spaces knowing only filth and hunger. Many never saw a tree or a clear sky. They played in alleys filled with refuse. Their laughter mingled with the cries of the sick and dying. Parents went to work in factories or sweatshops before dawn and returned long after dark, leaving their children to roam the streets or care for younger siblings. Disease and malnutrition stunted their growth, and many never lived to adulthood. The mortality rate among tenement children was staggering. In some districts, nearly half died before the age of 5. Doctors and charity workers who visited the slums wrote of children sleeping beside open drains, their bodies covered in sores, their eyes dull from hunger. In such conditions, life became a daily battle for breath, for food, for survival. The tenements did not just breed disease, they bred despair. The endless noise, the lack of privacy, the constant stench, and the ever-present fear of eviction wore down the spirit as much as the body. Many turned to alcohol for escape, while others simply collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. Women worked from home as seamstresses, bending over their sewing machines for 16 hours a day, earning just enough to pay rent. The constant drudgery and confinement drove many into hopelessness. Social reformers who ventured into the tenements were often struck by the silence of the residents, an eerie quiet born not of peace but of resignation. The physical design of the tenement itself contributed to the spread of disease. Early buildings were constructed without any concern for ventilation or sanitation. Rooms often had no windows, and the only light came from candles or oil lamps, which filled the air with smoke. Floors and walls absorbed years of moisture and waste, turning them into breeding grounds for mold and bacteria. Even when new building laws were passed requiring ventilation shafts and windows, landlords found ways to evade the rules. The air shafts they installed were often just narrow cracks between buildings, too small to provide real light or fresh air. Instead, they became traps for garbage, rats, and human waste. The reforms that were meant to bring relief instead created new forms of filth. Water was another source of misery. Tenement residents fetched it from shared pumps or cisterns that were easily contaminated. Waste from nearby previes seeped into the ground and poisoned the wells. Cholera outbreaks became a regular occurrence, and doctors traced many of them to the tenement blocks. But since the poor had no political power, their suffering was ignored. The city's leaders focused on beautifying the wealthy districts, paving streets, planting trees, and installing gaslights, while the tenements remained dark and pestilent. Even when health officials documented the squalor in official reports, little was done. The suffering of the poor was considered inevitable, even necessary, for the city's economic success. Amidst this landscape of decay, reformers and journalists began to speak out. Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant and reporter, became the most famous chronicler of tenement life. Armed with a camera and a sense of moral outrage, he entered the darkest alleys and took photographs that shocked the nation. His images showed sleeping children piled on the floor, families cooking beside open sewers, and rooms so small that the inhabitants had to take turns standing. In his book How the Other Half Lives, Riis wrote that, "Long ago it was said that one half of the world does not know how the other half lives." His work forced middle and upper class Americans to confront the filth and suffering hidden behind the city's glittering fad. Yet even with this exposure, change came slowly. The diseases of the tenement were not confined to its walls. Epidemics did not respect class boundaries. When cholera or smallpox spread, it reached beyond the slums and into the wealthier neighborhoods, carried by servants, workers, or contaminated water. but the response from the city was often to blame the victims rather than the conditions. Immigrants were accused of bringing disease with them, of being inherently dirty or immoral. Public health officials sometimes used outbreaks as justification for evictions and forced cleanings, actions that punished the poor without addressing the real causes of infection. The tenements were both a symptom and a scapegoat of urban disease, a convenient way for society to ignore its own responsibility. The people who lived in these buildings developed remarkable resilience. They learned to adapt to conditions that would have broken others. Neighbors shared food, cared for one another's children, and pooled money for funerals. Despite the misery, there was community. Religious institutions and cultural societies provided some measure of support. Immigrants from the same homeland gathered in tight, knit groups, keeping their languages, foods, and traditions alive amid the squalor. Yet even these bonds could not protect them from the ravages of disease. When one family member fell ill, infection spread quickly to the rest, and with no access to doctors or hospitals, death often followed. The tenements became laboratories for reform. Health inspectors, sociologists, and city planners used them as case studies to understand urban poverty. Some sought to improve living conditions by introducing model housing, better sanitation, and stricter regulations. Others saw the poor themselves as the problem, believing that their poverty was caused by moral weakness rather than economic inequality. These conflicting attitudes shaped the city's response for decades. Genuine reform was slow because it threatened powerful interests, landlords, builders, and politicians who profited from the misery. The cycle continued. Poverty produced disease, disease weakened labor, and weakened labor reinforced poverty. Even as the city grew wealthier, the tenements persisted. The Industrial Revolution demanded a constant supply of cheap labor, and the tenements supplied it. Every day, thousands left those dark buildings to work in sweatshops, factories, and construction sites. Their wages built the fortunes of the elite, yet they returned each night to the same cramped rooms. For the upper classes, the tenements were out of sight and out of mind. Carriages avoided the narrow streets, and the city's socialites rarely ventured below 14th Street. The diseases of the poor were dismissed as the price of progress, the unavoidable consequence of industrial success. When night fell, the tenement districts became a different kind of world. The sounds of coughing, crying infants, and drunken arguments filled the air. Gas lamps flickered weakly, casting shadows on cracked walls. The streets, slick with rain and waste, reflected the dim light of the city beyond. Inside, families huddled around stoves, trying to stay warm. The smell of damp wood, human sweat, and rot clung to everything. Rats gnawed at the floors. In the corners of the rooms, mold spread silently, feeding on the moisture. Every sense was assaulted by the environment. Sight, smell, touch, and sound all testified to a life lived on the edge of endurance. The disease-filled tenement was not just a physical place. It was a moral and social construct that revealed the contradictions of the Gilded Age. The same society that celebrated innovation, progress, and wealth had allowed these death traps to exist in its midst. The people who lived there were not failures or outcasts. They were the workers who built the city's infrastructure, who sewed its clothes, who cleaned its homes. Yet they were treated as if their suffering were natural, as if they were less than human. The tenements became both a home and a prison, a space that sustained life while destroying it. Over time, reform movements gained strength. Advocates pushed for housing regulations, better sanitation, and public health initiatives. The creation of the Tenement House Act of 1901 marked a turning point, setting minimum standards for ventilation, lighting, and fire safety. But these changes came after decades of preventable suffering. Generations had lived and died in those buildings, their lives consumed by disease and neglect. The tenements remained symbols of the inequality that defined the Gilded Age, a reminder that beneath every shining monument of progress, there are shadows where the cost is paid in human lives. The disease-filled tenements of New York were not accidents of history. They were deliberate results of choices made by those who prioritized profit over people, convenience over compassion. They revealed what happens when a society values its wealth more than its humanity, when the glitter of prosperity blinds it to the suffering beneath. The air of those rooms still lingers in the imagination, heavy and suffocating, carrying the ghosts of millions who lived and died in silence, unseen and unremembered by the world above them. The Gilded Age of New York was not only an era of grandeur and exploitation, but also one of awakening. While wealth and disease coexisted uneasily in the same city, a new force began to emerge, the voice of exposure and reform. Out of the suffocating air of the tenements rose journalists, photographers, doctors, and social reformers who dared to look where polite society refused. They entered the dark, narrow alleys of the Lower East Side, the basements where families slept beside refuse, and the attics where the forgotten gasped for breath. They carried with them the conviction that truth, once revealed, could become a weapon against indifference. These individuals did not possess great power or wealth, but they wielded the one thing the rich feared most: the mirror of reality. Among them stood Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant whose journey from poverty to reform became one of the most influential stories of the age. Having once lived in the tenements himself, Riis knew the smell of mold, the feeling of hunger, the humiliation of being invisible. He had worked as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, covering the crimes, deaths, and miseries of the slums. But Riis saw beyond the statistics and the sensational headlines. He understood that these people were not merely victims of circumstance. They were workers, families, human beings crushed by a system that thrived on their suffering. What set Riis apart was his decision to show the world what he saw. Armed with one of the earliest forms of flash photography, Riis ventured into the shadows of New York's tenements, capturing images that would burn themselves into the conscience of a nation. He photographed families sleeping on bare floors, men slumped over workbenches, children playing in piles of garbage, and women sewing by candlelight in rooms without air or light. The sudden burst of flash powder illuminated scenes the wealthy had never seen, and perhaps never wanted to. The stark whiteness of his photographs revealed every wrinkle, every hollow cheek, every sign of despair. His work culminated in his groundbreaking 1890 publication, How the Other Half Lives, a book that tore the golden mask off the Gilded Age and exposed the moral rot beneath. Riis's writing was as powerful as his photographs. He described with vivid detail the lives of those trapped in the city's underbelly. He wrote of babies sleeping on cellar floors, of mothers nursing infants beside overflowing toilets, of men who labored 14 hours a day, and then returned to airless rooms where the smell of sewage hung thick. His tone was not that of pity but of outrage. He accused society of building its wealth on the bodies of the poor, of allowing greed to dictate human destiny. His words carried the urgency of a man who had seen too much to remain silent. In one passage, he described a tenement airshaft as graveyard of dirt, garbage, and dead cats, a chilling metaphor for the moral filth of the era. The response to Riis's work was explosive. For the first time, the upper classes were forced to confront the world that existed beyond their glittering ballrooms. The photographs appeared in lectures, newspapers, and exhibitions. Audiences gasped as they saw the conditions under which the city's laborers lived. Reformers and politicians began to speak of tenement reform as a moral necessity. Even powerful figures like Theodore Roosevelt, then serving as police commissioner, sought out Riis, walking with him through the slums and pledging to improve living conditions. The exposure created ripples that reached far beyond New York, influencing urban reform movements across the United States. Yet Riis was not alone. His work was part of a broader wave of social investigation that characterized the progressive era. Journalists, often called muckrakers, began to uncover corruption, exploitation, and inequality in every corner of American life. In the slums of New York, this spirit of reform found fertile ground. Writers such as Stephen Crane, author of Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, captured the brutal reality of urban poverty through fiction, exposing how environment shaped destiny. Crane's work, though fictional, was rooted in observation, a portrait of the hopelessness that grew from tenement life. His stories stripped away sentimentality, showing how poverty consumed innocence and how society's moral codes crumbled under the weight of hunger. Doctors and public health officials joined the chorus. Physicians working in the tenements began to document the physical toll of overcrowding, the spread of tuberculosis, the prevalence of infant mortality, the deformities caused by malnutrition. The New York City Board of Health conducted inspections that revealed shocking statistics: entire buildings without sanitation, families sharing a single toilet, children sleeping beside open sewage. These reports, published in newspapers and reform journals, lent scientific authority to what Riis had shown in pictures. They transformed compassion into policy, linking disease not to moral failure but to social conditions. Religious organizations also took part in the movement. Settlement houses, such as those established by Lillian Wald and Florence Kelly, offered education, healthcare, and advocacy to the urban poor. Wald's Henry Street settlement became a symbol of practical compassion, a place where nurses and volunteers entered the tenements not as observers but as allies. They brought medical care directly to the sick, clean water to the thirsty, and hope to those who had long been forgotten. Through these efforts, reformers challenged the prevailing belief that poverty was inevitable. They argued that the environment, not moral weakness, created the conditions for disease and despair. The exposure of the tenements was not just a humanitarian act, it was a political one. The revelations threatened powerful interests, landlords, developers, and politicians who profited from the misery. Many of these men sought to discredit Riis and other reformers, calling them agitators or sentimentalists. But the truth was too visible to ignore. The images spoke louder than denial. Reform-minded politicians began drafting housing laws to regulate construction, mandate ventilation, and provide access to clean water. Public outrage demanded accountability, and for a moment, the city seemed to awaken to its conscience. However, the process of reform was uneven and slow. Some saw the tenement problem as a moral spectacle, an opportunity to demonstrate charity without changing the system that produced the misery. Philanthropists funded model housing projects, but these served only a fraction of the population. Others used the discourse of reform to push out immigrant communities under the guise of sanitation. Despite these limitations, the exposure of the tenement horrors planted the seeds of urban reform movements that would continue into the 20th century. It introduced a new idea, that government and society bore responsibility for the conditions in which people lived. The power of Riis's photographs lay not only in their realism but in their humanity. Each image told a story that statistics could not. A child sleeping on a doorstep was not just an example of poverty, it was a moral indictment. A mother washing clothes beside a leaking pipe was not just a worker, she was a symbol of endurance. Riis did not stage his photographs, he captured what existed, and that authenticity pierced the veneer of respectability that shielded the Gilded Age elite. He forced the city to look at itself and see the contradiction between its wealth and its squalor. The same city that celebrated invention and progress had allowed its workers to rot in darkness. Reformers and journalists after Riis carried his torch forward. The idea of exposure journalism became a defining tool of progressivism. Writers like Ida Tarbell exposed corporate monopolies. Upton Sinclair revealed the horrors of the meatpacking industry. Lincoln Steffens uncovered political corruption. But Riis's legacy was unique. His work gave visual form to suffering. In an age when the camera was still new, his use of light in the darkness became both a metaphor and a method. The flash that illuminated the faces of the poor also illuminated the moral blindness of society. The tenements, once invisible, became a subject of endless public debate. Newspapers ran serialized stories about slum conditions, charities organized lectures, and educators used Riis's photographs in classrooms. The tenement became a symbol, not just of poverty, but of what America risked becoming if it ignored its own people. Artists, writers, and reformers found in the tenements both horror and inspiration. Painters depicted scenes of working class life with new realism. The idea of social responsibility began to replace the old faith in self-made success. In the political realm, reform took institutional form. The Tenement House Committee was established to investigate housing conditions and propose laws. The 1901 Tenement House Act mandated basic standards for light, ventilation, and sanitation, marking one of the first times the government intervened directly in housing reform. Though imperfect, it represented a shift in ideology, a recognition that the city had obligations to its citizens. Public health initiatives followed, bringing sanitation systems, garbage collection, and clean water to neighborhoods that had long been neglected. The exposure of the tenements also changed the way Americans thought about urban life itself. The city, once celebrated as a symbol of opportunity, came to be seen as a site of moral struggle. Reformers spoke of uplifting the slums, but what they truly meant was confronting the consequences of unrestrained capitalism. The gilded towers of progress had cast too long a shadow. Every reform, every law, every photograph chipped away at the illusion that prosperity could exist without justice. The disease-filled rooms of the tenements became the moral conscience of the age, the evidence that progress, if unchecked by compassion, was nothing more than gilded decay. As more people saw the images and read the reports, empathy began to replace indifference. Churches, schools, and civic organizations joined the movement, organizing relief efforts and demanding policy changes. The exposure created a language of social responsibility that transcended class divisions. It asked not only how the other half lived, but why it was forced to live that way. It forced society to question whether a city could truly be called civilized while allowing its citizens to die in squalor. The reformers did not destroy poverty, but they shattered the silence that had protected it. The cultural impact of Riis and his contemporaries endured long after the Gilded Age ended. Their work inspired new generations of photojournalists, activists, and urban planners. The belief that the camera could be an instrument of truth became central to the social movements of the 20th century. The idea that light could expose injustice continued to resonate in labor struggles, civil rights campaigns, and humanitarian efforts. What began in the dark corridors of New York's tenements expanded into a broader understanding of society's moral obligations. In many ways, the exposure and reform movements of the Gilded Age marked the beginning of modern social consciousness. They replaced apathy with awareness, charity with accountability, and ignorance with knowledge. The disease-filled tenement was no longer just a place. It was a mirror reflecting the soul of the city. The reformers who entered that world with notebooks, cameras, and compassion carried the burden of truth, transforming it into a call for change that would echo far beyond their time. The legacy of the disease-filled tenements of New York's Gilded Age did not vanish with the passing of time. It lingered like a shadow stretching across the centuries. The moral and physical decay that those slums represented left an imprint on the city's conscience, shaping its architecture, its policies, and even its imagination. Though the buildings were eventually torn down, the deeper wounds they inflicted, inequality, neglect, and social blindness, continued to pulse beneath the surface of urban life. The story of those tenements was not only about the diseases that consumed the poor, it was about the sickness that festered in a society content to divide itself into the comfortable and the condemned. It is impossible to speak of New York's triumphs without remembering the bodies upon which its wealth was built, the invisible scaffolding of human suffering that propped up the gilded towers of progress. When the city entered the 20th century, reform laws began to reshape the physical landscape, yet they could not fully heal the moral one. New housing codes required windows for light, ventilation shafts for air, and access to clean water, but the divide between rich and poor persisted. The reformers had forced the city to look inward, but not all lessons were absorbed. For many, the tenement problem became a historical curiosity, something overcome by progress rather than an enduring truth about power and poverty. But history, like disease, has a way of resurfacing when ignored. The same patterns of neglect that defined the tenements reappeared in new forms. In overcrowded public housing, in underfunded neighborhoods, in the invisible walls separating wealth from want. The leaky ceilings and dark corridors of the 19th century transformed into the crumbling high rises of the 20th, proving that architecture alone could not cure inequality. The moral legacy of the tenements endured because it spoke to something larger than buildings and disease. It revealed a recurring blindness in human society. During the Gilded Age, prosperity became an idol, and progress was worshipped as a god. The tenements stood as the unacknowledged altar where the sacrifices were made. Immigrants, laborers, and children were fed into the furnace of industry, and out of their suffering came steel, glass, and gold. When journalists like Jacob Riis exposed the truth, their work did more than document, it held up a mirror. The mirror revealed that poverty was not an accident, but a product of choices, policies, and indifference. That truth remains relevant in every age where wealth accumulates faster than empathy. The inequality that defined the Gilded Age did not disappear, it evolved. The concentration of wealth that characterized late 19th century New York has found new expression in the 21st century's skyscrapers and gated communities. The conditions are different, but the logic is the same. The wealthy still live above, removed from the struggles below, insulated by distance and privilege. The poor still live where society chooses not to look, whether in neglected housing projects, forgotten rural towns, or overcrowded shelters. The lesson of the tenements is not simply about the past, but about the human capacity to forget. Each generation, it seems, must rediscover the same truth, that inequality breeds not only injustice but decay. The tenements' physical destruction did not erase the social geography they created. Neighborhoods once defined by disease and poverty continued to bear the stigma of neglect long after the buildings were gone. Immigrant communities were pushed outward, displaced by waves of redevelopment that often repeated the same mistakes under new names. Urban renewal, the mid-20th century attempt to modernize the city, demolished old tenement blocks but replaced them with sterile towers that isolated rather than united their residents. The spirit of reform had survived, but its execution was flawed. In trying to build a healthier city, planners often erased the human fabric of neighborhoods, forgetting that community is as essential as sanitation. The moral lesson of the Gilded Age tenements was that progress without compassion leads to corruption, yet that lesson has been learned and forgotten countless times. Even today, echoes of those old diseases can be found, not just tuberculosis or cholera, but the social diseases of apathy and greed. The pandemic era of the 21st century revealed that inequality still dictates who lives and who dies. In the cramped apartments of modern cities, in homeless shelters and migrant quarters, the same overcrowding, the same vulnerability reemerged. History repeated itself not because the facts were forgotten, but because the empathy they demanded was inconvenient. The tenement's legacy endures wherever people are treated as disposable in the pursuit of progress. The emotional power of the tenement story lies in its duality. It is both a tragedy and a warning. The people who lived there were victims, yes, but they were also survivors, building communities amid decay, finding dignity in squalor. Their endurance became part of the city's spirit, the unseen strength that underlies its resilience. Yet that endurance should never have been necessary. The same city that celebrated invention and culture forced its workers to live without sunlight or sanitation. This contradiction still defines urban life today, where skyscrapers stand beside shelters, where luxury towers rise over food banks. The disease-filled tenement may have been demolished, but its ghost still lingers in every city that tolerates inequality as normal. The legacy also lives in the city's architecture and planning. The laws that arose from tenement reform, the requirement for windows, courtyards, sanitation systems, became the foundation of modern housing policy. They set standards that improved lives for millions. But they also revealed the limits of reform when divorced from empathy. Regulations can mandate air and light, but they cannot legislate dignity. The deeper transformation requires moral will, the recognition that every human being deserves not just survival, but the conditions for life. The Gilded Age failed in this regard, and its failure continues to echo in the structures of the modern world. Culturally, the tenement became both a symbol and a warning. Writers, photographers, and filmmakers returned to its imagery again and again to confront the nation with its contradictions. The slums of the 19th century became metaphors for moral blindness in literature and art. The idea of the other half persisted, shifting its form but not its meaning. The immigrant mother washing clothes beside a leaking pipe became the single mother working 2 jobs in a modern metropolis. The child coughing in a windowless room became the child growing up in a polluted neighborhood. The context changed, but the essence of inequality remained. The moral reckoning inspired by the tenements also reshaped political thought. It gave rise to the idea that the state has a duty to protect the vulnerable, that freedom without fairness is hollow. The progressive era, with its emphasis on public health, workers' rights, and education, grew from the shock of that exposure. But as decades passed and prosperity returned, complacency set in. The same cycle repeated itself: outrage followed by reform, reform followed by forgetfulness. The tenement story became a relic, taught in classrooms but rarely felt in policy. The deeper lesson, that society's strength is measured by how it treats its weakest, was often reduced to sentiment. The photographs of Jacob Riis still speak across time because they capture not only the faces of suffering, but the expression of endurance. Each image asks a question. What kind of civilization allows this? That question remains unanswered, for every generation must confront its own version of the tenement. In the sprawling megacities of today, the slums of Lagos, Mumbai, and Manila mirror the conditions of 19th century New York. Overcrowding, disease, and neglect persist under different skies, proving that the moral challenge is universal. The Gilded Age's legacy is global because the forces that created it, capitalism without conscience, progress without justice, are global. The disease-filled tenements also changed how Americans thought about health and morality. In the 19th century, disease was often seen as divine punishment or personal failure. The tenements shattered that illusion. They made it clear that illness could be social, that poverty itself was a kind of contagion. This realization marked a turning point in public health, linking sanitation, housing, and welfare to morality. The tenement thus transformed disease from a private affliction into a collective responsibility. That insight remains vital, especially in an age when health disparities continue to mirror economic divides. The emotional residue of the tenement years clings to the cultural memory of New York. Even in its most prosperous moments, the city carries the faint echo of those narrow hallways and airless rooms. The myth of the American dream cannot be separated from the nightmare of the tenement. For every story of success, there is one of sacrifice. The skyscrapers that now define the skyline were built by hands that once labored in darkness. The streets that tourists walk today were once rivers of refuse and disease. The contrast is breathtaking, and it reminds us that the cost of progress has never been evenly shared. The enduring power of the Tenements' legacy lies in its ability to reveal the moral health of a society. When the gap between wealth and poverty widens, when empathy is replaced by indifference, the ghost of the tenement returns. It appears in headlines about housing crises, in statistics about child poverty, in photographs of overcrowded shelters. It appears wherever the pursuit of profit eclipses the dignity of human life. The disease that once spread through the lungs of the poor now spreads through the conscience of the comfortable. It whispers that the suffering of others is inevitable, that inequality is natural. That whisper is the true inheritance of the Gilded Age, and resisting it remains the unfinished work of every generation. The legacy also endures in the way cities define success. The Gilded Age celebrated opulence, the mansions of Fifth Avenue, the opera houses, the glittering balls. But beneath the glamour lay decay. Today, cities still measure their greatness by wealth, by skyline, by spectacle, rarely by compassion. The lesson of the tenement demands a different measure. A city's greatness lies not in its towers but in its humanity, in how it shelters its people. Yet time and again, the same blindness reappears. Homelessness grows beside luxury, hunger persists beside abundance. The patterns of the past replay themselves, dressed in modern clothes. The disease-filled tenements of New York's Gilded Age thus remain more than a chapter in history. They are a warning etched in brick and memory. They remind us that progress built on inequality is fragile, that light without justice is merely another kind of darkness. The reformers of the past illuminated that truth, but it is up to each age to keep the flame alive. The tenements may have been demolished, but their shadow stretches across time, falling upon every city that forgets the cost of its own splendor. Their legacy endures not only in the laws they inspired, but in the questions they continue to ask. The same questions that echo, unanswered, wherever prosperity and poverty stand side by side.